Divas, I am thrilled to treat you to today's special guest, Craig Fugate, former FEMA administrator who also served as Florida's Director of Emergency Management. He has forgotten more about emergency preparedness and response than most of us will ever know. Also, let's not forget, he is the creator of the Waffle House Index. That's right, Craig Fugate and the Waffle House Index. Listen, we talk about the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina and Florida's assistance to Mississippi and so much more. Disasters, preparedness, what keeps Craig Fugate up at night? Tune in and find out. Join us for today's deeper dive with former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate.
People forget Katrina actually started out in the Bahamas and hit Florida first. And we had fatalities, we had over 1 million power outages. If Katrina had done nothing else, it would have been a fairly significant response for Florida.
You're listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida. Let's dive in.
Divas, oh my gosh, I am so excited. Yes, he is one of my OGs, and he is renowned emergency management director, special guest Craig Fugate. He's the Florida Division of Emergency Management Director. And he also was the chief of FEMA from 2009 to 2017. He oversaw the largest response to storms in state's history, I believe, in 2004. We'll get to all that. Welcome to the show, Craig Fugate.
Thanks for having me.
When I was setting up the recording equipment and Craig's on a Zoom with me, you guys can't see him, but I can. I asked him if he missed me, and what was your answer?
Oh, I enjoyed the Tallahassee press corps a lot more than I did the folks in Washington.
Why was that?
I think we had built a relationship. You guys never cut me any slack, but I also figured if I told you what I knew, it was fair. I didn't have to like the criticism, but I always knew it wasn't like there was an agenda.
I have to say that you were so available to us. You would, this was back, they don't do it this way anymore, but you used to hold these briefings. We used to sleep out there, we didn't bring our sleeping bags or anything, but we were hunkered down at the EOC with you, and I remember sometimes you'd be standing outside there were all these gnats out in front of that building, and of course it's always in the summer and there's gnats and it's hot, and you were very patient and very available, and it really helped because I was working for the Palm Beach Post at the time of that, when we had those 4 hurricanes in 1 year. And we had 2 years. It wasn't just 2004. I think it was 2004 and 2005 when we had these historic storms and, powerful storms. And you were, just the accessibility. You always, also one thing, Craig, that I really appreciated about you, you never lost your temper. You got to have been exhausted, and you were so patient, and us asking questions, wanting answers. How many people died? How many, what's this? What's the damage assessments? What's that? And I just felt like you were a very calming and informative presence during a very frightening time.
Yeah, I was kind of interesting. I had a similar approach when I was in D.C. And a lot of people were pushing back like, the media is not your friend. And I'm like, no, they have a job to do. But I think we had an understanding. When it was emergency public information, you guys would verbatim get the information out to the public. And that was our amplifier to get what people needed to know. And then when you started asking questions about, the mistakes or other things, I just felt, hey, we're a sunshine state. I'm going to either tell you now, or you're going to dig it through my emails. And so I just want to be transparent and not really have that agenda. And I found that even in DC, I found that worked better. But I really saw especially the folks there at the state EOC, I saw you as part of the team. And there was always that fine line. You guys were very careful. You didn't want to cross. You didn't want to get co-opted and not tell when we weren't doing a good job. But I think we also had a good understanding when it's emergency public information. Let's get that out to the public, and then we'll deal with what's going on when we get to that point.
It's so important because, I'm covering statewide news, but I was working for a hometown paper. It was a different paper than it is today. I mean, it was still a paper. I guess it's, everything's online now. But yes, we did have a job to do, and people were looking to us for information, and it was, things were changing rapidly on the ground. But anyway, thank you very much for that. Things have changed a lot in the way that information is delivered and controlled, and maybe not always to the benefit of the residents or people in Florida, especially those in Florida who don't have experience with storms. Let's talk about, we're doing the 20th anniversary of Katrina in 2005. You were the state emergency management chief during Katrina. I know this because I was covering Katrina in Biloxi, and that was a very different storm that impact than what had happened in New Orleans, which got a lot of the coverage. And they were talking a lot about Florida. And I think that Florida was sending resources into Mississippi. And just tell me a little bit about lessons learned from Katrina. Obviously the Superdome is one issue, but can you recollect for me, since it's the anniversary, what you experienced here in Florida from Katrina?
People forget Katrina actually started out in the Bahamas and hit Florida first. And we had fatalities. We had over 1 million power outages. If Katrina had done nothing else, it would have been a fairly significant response for Florida. And we had already been hit by Hurricane Dennis earlier that year. So as we were getting ready for that storm, it came across very quickly, was heading into the Gulf. And one of the early forecast tracks had it going into the Florida Panhandle as a major hurricane. So our lesson we had learned from the 4 hurricanes is you don't wait till it hits and get ready. We started moving people, National Guard, search and rescue teams, law enforcement, and getting people ready if the storm went towards Tallahassee or in the Panhandle. And then if you remember, the Hurricane Center moved that track all the way over to go to New Orleans. And I remember in the EOC, a lot of people say, hey, are we going to shut down? Because basically we were moving into the recovery phase in South Florida from Katrina. And they were like, we're going to release the teams and go home. I said, no, because somebody's going to get hit. And don't forget, Hurricane Ivan did that.
That's right.
It went towards New Orleans and tracked back, and we got slammed at Pensacola.
Yeah.
I said, somebody's going to get hit. And we did video conference calls with FEMA, with all the states of the impacted area. And so we had agreed on that whoever got hit, we would all move from either east to west or west to east to who got hit. And we were doing that under the Emergency Management Systems Compact. It's one of the legacies of the late Governor Childs and the lessons learned after Hurricane Andrew. That we needed to have a formal mechanism for states providing assistance that didn't depend upon the federal government. So under that, we began sending, and ultimately, I think the rough numbers are we sent about 6,000 folks from Florida into Mississippi. We expended close to $200 million of state dollars that we ultimately got reimbursed from the state of Mississippi for supplies. And I remember one of the emails I got early on was from Bill Carwell, who had been our federal coordinating officer from FEMA in the 2004 hurricane season. He was in Mississippi as the federal coordinating officer. He sends me an email. It's basically send MREs or meals ready to eat, any additional law enforcement. Know you're sending law enforcement, send more. And we pulled 250 body bags off of the Dixie County command post. Can you send more? Just to give people some, I think most people, if you weren't in Mississippi, people don't even know that Mississippi per capita took a greater hit from the storm than New Orleans. And most of the damage in New Orleans was flooding from levees failure. In Mississippi, remember, if you're down on the coast, we had debris lines all the way up to I-10.
I was there. I spent, before you go on, I just tell you my experience. We headed over there, my photographer and I, in a rented SUV, and he picked me up in Tallahassee, and we stopped to take some pictures of the waves coming in on the downtown at Pensacola in the bay there. And when I got out of the truck, a huge gust of wind came and bent the car door back. And we had to get some guys to help us close it. And then I could never, for the rest of that 10 days or however many week long trip, I couldn't get in and out of the passenger side. I had to climb over or sit in the back. And then we headed to Mobile the night of, so we rode out the storm in Mobile. We begged and pleaded and got a hotel in downtown Mobile, and that was flooded. If you remember, the Water Street is it Water Street? I think that was flooded. They had no power. Then the next morning, we drove into Biloxi before people who had evacuated were even there. And so we found these, on the coast, the river casino boats were dislodged. The entire city blocks were razed. There was nothing but rubble. So we were walking around there, and remember, there was no cell phone, no water, no power. So nothing, like really nothing. We had to stay kind of within earshot or eyeshot of each other because our cell phones weren't working. We found this boat, a sailboat, in the middle of what looked to be a parking lot, which actually wasn't a parking lot, but we thought it was a parking lot. And he was taking pictures of it, and I said, I heard this dog barking, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's a dog on this boat. And it wasn't a parking lot because there had been buildings there. But anyway, it was, several hundred yards away from the shore. And we went on the boat, we got up there, and there was an old man on the boat with his dog, and he had gotten injured. And so we figured out how to give him some food and got his phone number and figured out where the Red Cross was. It was anyway, so that was our adventure. We wrote a story about that, and we did get in touch with his daughter in another state. And on the 1-year anniversary of Katrina, she actually called me and thanked us for helping out her dad. He had been moving his boat from Pass Christian and lost power, and so he just ended up getting lost on shore. But anyway, I digress. That was what it was. It was a true disaster. I rode with the mayor along the coastal road there, and as they were finding bodies, I was in the car with the mayor of Biloxi, and the police station was inundated. It was a mess. It was really bad, and unfortunately, I think they did get lost in the disaster coverage because of what was going on in New Orleans.
Now, but for us, we did something we'd never really done before.
You were the cavalry, though. Florida was the cavalry from our.
Well, Florida had gotten a lot of help as far back as 1998 during the wildfire seasons, and then all through 2004, a lot of states had sent people down under the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. So it was really our turn to pay it back. And it was actually easier for us to get into southern Mississippi than it was for the state of Mississippi, because we were driving across I-10, which was relatively open. They were trying to get from Jackson south, and all the trees were down. People forget Katrina actually went right up the middle of Mississippi and knocked everything down. So and again, it was Governor Bush basically, when we were getting all these requests and we'd sent the initial help and they're asking for more help. And I made the decision we're going to do that. Governor Bush basically said, how do we, what do you need from me? I said, you need to call Governor Barber and make sure that he's cool with this, because we're acting faster than the state of Mississippi can give us missions, because we had people on the ground, they were seeing it. We kind of took the approach that just treat it like one of our Florida counties. If they need it, just do it. We'll figure it out later. And I can remember getting to the coast about 2 weeks in with Governor Bush, and he's looking at all the damage. He couldn't believe wind did that. I said, this wasn't wind. This is all storm surge.
Mm-hmm.
He'd not really seen that level of devastation except for some areas in Pensacola Beach during Ivan.
Right.
Most damages in 2004 was really the wind, widespread wind damage. So for one, that was it. The other thing was I finally met Governor Haley Barbour. And again, he was just very thankful for all the folks that Florida sent. But it wasn't just us in the state. I mean, we had a lot of local government there. We had a lot of our volunteer agencies. We even had some of our private sector partners that worked with us in the '04 hurricanes that went with us to Mississippi, and were helping restore communications and get things back up. So, um, it was for us, it was like a month that we were running the emergency operations center just to support Mississippi.
Yeah, and I really, when I said you were the cavalry, because we were in Biloxi covering what was going on in Biloxi, but we were stationed at this hotel in Mobile, so we were driving back and forth, and you had to go about 50 miles outside of Biloxi to get any cell phone service. And when we would be traveling on the, and we'd see the convoys coming from Florida, it really, like, we felt like the cavalry was coming. Like, okay, that's Katrina, and Florida did a great job. And we'll be right back with Craig Fugate.
Together, we've been through it. Big storms, long hot nights, and the sigh of relief when the lights come on. At Tampa Electric, we never stop preparing. We strengthen lines, trim trees, and underground miles of power lines every year. And when a storm hits, we're all in. Every team member works around the clock until the power's back on for everyone. Yay! Because together, we can power through any storm. See how you can prepare at tampaelectric.com/stormcenter.
Divas, it's that time. What time is it? It's time for the news in haikus. The news in haikus. Disasters abound. Floods, storms, wildfires, terrorism. Eyes on Waffle House. That's the news in haikus. Don't forget, we'd love to hear your haiku. You can slide them into my DMs, or you can send them to podcasts, that's podcasts with an S, at e.newsserviceflorida.com. Wherever you're listening, please don't forget to subscribe and give us a rating if you like what we're doing. And we're back with Craig Fugate, former FEMA administrator. Let's find out how you got started in emergency management. I know your backstory, but let's let the divas, we call them the divas because they're divas. So let's let our listeners know how you ended up as the head of FEMA.
I answered my phone. I was a lieutenant in fire rescue in Alachua County, Gainesville, Florida. I just became a lieutenant, and I got a phone call that they wanted to bring the new lieutenants downtown and give us some managerial experience. And they gave us 3 projects to pick, and one of them was updating the county's disaster plan. I said, well, that sounds interesting. I'll do that. That was in February 1987. I never went back on the road. Next thing I know is the county manager's like, I want him running this program. And I ended up doing that for from 87 till 96. And then, basically in 1997, Joe Myers was state director.
Oh, yeah. God, that's a blast from the past. Yeah.
He just, Katrina, and since Andrew and Joe asked me if I'd come up there and become one of the bureau chiefs for preparedness and response. Eric Tolbert had that job, had just left to go to North Carolina to take the job. And I said, yeah, I'm interested. So we went through that process. Again, they reached out to me. I wasn't looking. Joe called me. And so I went up there, and then Joe had left, and that was in 2001. And we dealt with not too bad of a year until September 11th, and then the terrorist attacks. And shortly thereafter, Governor Bush called me up and said, I'm gonna announce you permanently as director, because I was working as interim, and they were doing this. They were going to do a national search, and it was, you remember when John Agrinobi became Secretary of Health?
Oh, yeah.
Got named on the same day. But it was funny because Governor Bush calls, when the governor's calling you, your first question is, what did we do?
Well, I'm in trouble.
Yeah. And so
like the principal getting called to the principal's office.
So he gets me on the phone. And he says, Craig, I'm going to announce you tomorrow as director and everything. I said, well, I'm honored. Thank you very much, sir. And he said, but you're going to have to change your affiliation. And I didn't say anything. And I just long paused. And he said, you turn me down, wouldn't you? I said, yes, sir. He says, well, I guess I can have one Gator on my team.
Oh, a Gator. I thought, of course, we all thought you meant change from Democrat to Republican.
Well, I think that's what he was thinking. But
right.
my grandmother governor would have a lifelong Democrat, I'd been exiled from the family. And so he said, I can have one Democrat on my team. So I got announced. And again, it was a phone call.
He did. He did. I actually changed my voter registration from Democrat to independent to Republican during the Jeb administration because I think they looked all of us up too. So just FYI.
And then the same thing happened. I was, state director. We'd been through all the hurricanes. So it was 2009. I was working for Governor Chris, who it was kind of funny because his transition team was going to clear out all the former Bush people and bring in their own team. And I was going through their interrogations and stuff, and it was being very vague. And the first time I sat down with the governor-elect, he's like, welcome me to the team. And his staff's going, we're still vetting him. And he'd already stopped me in the Capitol Rotunda when he was AG and said, hey, if I'm governor, will you stay and work for me? I said, yes, sir. But the one thing I really appreciate about Governor Chris was I get the call. Again, I didn't apply. I got the call to go meet with Secretary Napolitano about, they were kind of vague about it, but a job. And I went up there and I did that call. And I went up, met with her. She asked me questions, talked. I come home. I had already called over to the governor's office, talked to the chief of staff, said, hey, I got this call and we'll go up there. And their first things, what do you need from us? Can we help you?
Oh, wow.
They were very supportive. So when the White House, and I was in close contact with the governor. When the White House says we're going to announce you, I said, well, there's three people I got to tell first. I got to tell my wife, I got to tell my team, and I got to tell my governor. And they said, you got that, but we're embargoed until noon. So I went over, did all that stuff. And I had met with Governor Chris that morning before they announced it. And I was coming in to resign. And this is the thing that I really, you can say, anybody can say anything they want to about Governor Chris. I have to tell you, he did me a solid when I said, I'm coming in to resign. He says, Craig, I don't want you to resign. We don't know how this is going to go. And you're my guy. I'm in your corner, but I don't want you to resign until you're confirmed. So
good for him. He knew you were leaving and he had your back.
He had my back and said, you're my guy. It doesn't work out. You're still my guy. I was, and again, state, we don't pay a lot for state people. And I wasn't sitting on some, trust fund that could allow me to live independently. I needed to work.
That's right. You needed a job.
And that was a solid he gave me that, I will always be grateful.
All right. Well, let's give Governor Christ. There you go. There you go, Charlie, from Craig. And so you got the call. They did confirm you. You went up to Washington, or did you go to Washington, or did you work from Gainesville?
Well, no, you had to be there. This was pre-COVID. You worked where you were
trying
assigned.
To picture you in Washington, D.C. It just seems like such an odd fit to me, but tell me how that went.
I got asked by a lot of people, what's it like? And I'm like, it's a lot like Tallahassee, just bigger. Because if you ever dealt with the Florida legislature, you had every range of people in the legislature, people ego-driven to the, really good folks that were trying to do the right thing for the state, no matter what side of the aisle they sat on. You had some people that were just out there like flamethrowers, just making noise and stuff like that, and going to a hearing at the Capitol, depending upon was the chairman either mad at you or mad at your boss, and you were just a convenient target. You remember how that a lot of times they wouldn't go after your boss or the governor, but you were fair game.
So you learned how to play the game pretty early on.
Yeah, and again, I didn't really.
You already knew how because of your experience in Tallahassee.
Yeah, so it's just more of them. It was my initial reaction, and to a certain degree, I was just me. I'm pretty blunt. Didn't really play the political game. Didn't do all of the backslapping, and so I kind of just kept doing what I'd been doing because I had worked in Florida, and it worked relatively well. But I got yelled at on the phone by various members of Congress for various things. I got yelled at by governors for saying it's a disaster declaration. So I figured, I'm getting yelled at by everybody, by both sides. Probably doing what I'm supposed to.
I'm not sure. I hear people say that all the time. Like when you piss people off on both sides, that means you're doing a good job. I don't know. I'm not sure, but I'll let that one slide.
here's where it gets where I believe that's true. Part of what FEMA's job is to recommend to the president when a governor asks for a disaster declaration. And I look at FEMA's job as an umpire. We're calling balls and strikes.
Mm-hmm.
We're not, but we're saying this doesn't warrant a disaster declaration or this one does. And then the president ultimately makes that decision. Well, I get calls from both sides. And initially, there was this tendency to think that FEMA was favoring Democrats over Republicans.
It's still, that's still, isn't it? Still.
GAO did the report, and it basically said we were calling balls and strikes. We turned down both sides equally.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I got yelled at by Republicans and Democrats who felt that, we were not being responsive to their needs. And, my job was this is a staff recommendation. We don't really think it succeeded state capabilities of state. We don't recommend the president declare a disaster.
But you were there for the whole 8 years, right? Weren't you?
Yeah, I got there. The confirmation and getting nominated and everything. I actually got sworn in May of '97. No, 2009.
Right, yeah.
2009,
yeah.
I got sworn in. And I served through the last day, the last minute of the administration, because I was asked by the chief of staff to stay because they want to have a smooth handoff.
Right.
And disasters that occur an hour before the swearing in means
That's
the
right.
Obama administration has to respond to it.
It was the Obama administration. I don't think we didn't mention that, but people who can't put the years together. That's
the Obama administration. This is the other funny thing. When they were going through all the vetting and everything, somewhere in there they discovered I was a registered Democrat. And they really thought because I'd worked for Governor Bush and Governor Christ that I was a Republican. And they thought they were going to be able to announce a crossover.
Bipartisan.
And so they were
disappointed. So Jeb was disappointed and the Obama administration was disappointed. Well, there you are doing something right.
But, generally I'm pretty, nonpartisan. In my line of work, picking sides is not conducive to working in disasters because you got to work with everybody.
That's right.
So my whole approach to this has been pretty much, I'm nonpartisan. I call things as I see them. I'll offer my commentary, but I tend to stay out of the politics. I don't campaign. That's the other thing. The Obama administration, I was an unknown entity to them. I wasn't a donor. I wasn't, supportive. I had not done anything publicly. So again, I was an atypical political appointee.
Well, and at the time you were appointed, was Charlie still a Republican, or had he?
Yep. No, he was still governor.
So by the time you left Florida as DEM director, Florida had really become a model for the nation in how to treat disasters. Am I wrong or am I right?
Well, I think we were getting a lot of people were looking at, well, how were you doing it? How did you go to the 4 hurricanes back to back? How did you send all these folks to Mississippi and Katrina? We got turned around and got slammed with Wilma, and that was like a whole new nightmare of stuff to deal with. And so I think people were interested in well, how are we doing it? And I cautioned people. I said, well, just because it's working here doesn't necessarily mean it works somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
But here's what we're doing. We really try to avoid, saying, look how great we are. People kept coming to us. We're going, well, here's what we did. And a lot of that stuff was because we kept learning the things that weren't, working and what we had to do. And we finally, I think, probably the biggest thing about Andrew and the late Governor Childs was we had a much different mindset in Florida. If you think about big disasters, they'll have a hearing, they'll find somebody, they'll fire them, and nothing changes. Governor Childs did something pretty unusual. Is he appointed Senator Phil Lewis, former Senate President, Republican, to chair what then became known as the Lewis Commission, to ask a different question of not who was wrong, but what do we need to do differently before the next hurricane? And that report became the foundation we used in Florida to build that team. Governor Bush took that and ran with it. And so by the time we were getting hit with all these hurricanes, it was out of the painful lessons we learned in Andrew.
Yeah.
And had dealt with previous storms, wildfires. By the time we got 2004, really had taken those lessons to heart. And that's what we try to show people. It's like, we just didn't show up and respond effectively. We had built a team. If you remember Governor Bush, he wouldn't show up for photo ops in the EOC. He'd go in there and work.
I know. He was he was on the other side of the window when they used to let us, look in at what you were doing. And he would be on the other side of the windows and talk about hunkering down. And Jeb too, the way that he managed disasters, he also had a very, he's very strong personality, but I traveled to a lot of disasters with him and with many governors actually. And you really had the sense of somebody who was in charge, knew what he was doing, had a team that knew what they were doing. It was very reassuring to watch him as the head of state managing these disasters with somebody like you. And I'm sounding, and people are going to think I'm like a shameless suck up here, but I'm really not. I'm just saying, like, from I'm experience on the ground, in planes and helicopters and swamp buggies, and I walked through the woods in a forest fire with Jeb one time, and that was probably one of the scariest experiences I had at a national disaster in a natural disaster, other than the when the hurricane is actually coming on. And I wanted to ask you, I want to talk about Deepwater Horizon because that's something I also covered, and that was it's a disaster that you were the head of FEMA when that occurred, right? How kind of a different challenge was that for you?
Well, this goes back to the framework of our emergency management system starts with the Constitution, actually, and then the federal and state laws. And one of the things that was different about Deepwater Horizon was you had a federal agency that was in charge of that response, and that was the U.S. Coast Guard. And the governors, that was a lot of friction because normally in disasters, they're in charge. And the Coast Guard was in charge, and they were coordinating a unified command with BP and the others that were involved in that. And the governors were like, hey, wait a minute, it's our coast, it's our industries, we're being impacted by, why aren't we in charge? And the White House was also thrown in that mix. And it really comes back to, under the Constitution, all power is not reserved to the federal government, belong to the states and the people. But one of the powers reserved to the federal government is interstate commerce.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a law that generates what's called the National Contingency Plan that deals with oil spills and hazardous materials of national significance. And it basically says those incidents that could enter to or impact an interstate or navigable waterway, the federal government's in charge. And it puts the EPA and the Coast Guard in charge of it, depending upon whether it's on land or at sea. And so now you're dealing with an oil spill. Coast Guard's in charge. FEMA's not really a major part of that. We got brought some briefings. Our role is really support Coast Guard. And so as we got into this, we ended up helping the Coast Guard more with building liaisons with the governors and local officials. We had those connections. We work with them all the time. We did some work and used some of our systems that we use to register people after disasters to help them set up the initial mechanism for people to register for financial assistance from BP when they set all that up. But by and large, our job was supportive and the Coast Guard was in charge. And it really, I think, for a lot of people, just really hard to grasp that governors who dealt with all these hurricanes and everything else that have this oil washing up on their shore going, why aren't we in charge? It's like, because Coast Guard, that's what the law is. And I think over time that got better. But there was a lot of friction.
Not just the governors, not just the state. I mean, because the locals were, I was living in Pensacola for about 6 months when I went over there to cover that. And I stayed there off and on for about 6 months. And there was a lot of friction with the local governments and then the counties and the cities and also the business owners, so there was a lot of pressure, many pressure points in that disaster. So, we've talked about different kinds of disasters. What do you have? Is there any one particular type of disaster that that frightens you the most, or that not fright? I can see you're a tough guy. You don't get frightened, but that concerns you the most is storm, flood, tornado, fire.
Well, that's the landscape. And we got cyber. We still do deal with the risk of a nuclear event. Everybody thought the Cold War was over, but we never disarmed. And now we've got scenarios where it's not like I think there's going to be an intentional nuclear attack, but I think we can get into a situation that escalates so fast and people are making mistakes, and we end up with something. I mean, there's always been this fear that what happens if, we always did our wars with Russia with proxies so that we were very rarely ever troop on troop. But we've gotten close in Syria. We're seeing this Ukraine and other things where
Hmm.
what happens if Russia hits one of our early warning aircraft that's out of Ukraine? It's in NATO airspace, but they hit it. And maybe they thought it was somebody else. And now we have a U.S. aircraft. We almost got this with China when they took down one of our P-3s that was doing
That's
espionage, and they
right.
took it down. And now we've got diplomatic solutions, fortunately. But what happens when we have conflict? We get a de-escalation or an escalation of things. We have new teams that aren't well versed in these areas, and we make a mistake. And the time from launch to impact is less than 30 minutes.
Huh. So this is what keeps you up at night? The threat of nuclear war?
The threat of an escalation, whether it's a nuclear or conventional, where events move faster. In the Cold War, it was always, you were one button away, but there were so many layers and so well practiced and so many tools to de-escalate situations to keep it from ever getting there. When the Cold War went away, a lot of that went away as the
Hmm.
institutional knowledge.
Hmm.
Now we're in a situation where we have a peer adversary who's routinely threatening to use nuclear weapons whenever he doesn't get his way.
Right.
So, most people think that's all rhetoric. And I'm like, it's all rhetoric until this thing gets to the point where somebody makes a mistake. And maybe it's rhetoric, but somebody doesn't see it that way. And now it escalates. And so um, there's it's one of those scenarios where it's what we call the, least probable, but the highest consequence if it ever happened. And what do you do? And I don't think, initially most of the scenarios we're going to launch all the missiles and everything gets destroyed. It's
Hmm.
more of somebody launches, the window is so short that our ability to react and make decisions about that are so limited.
Hmm.
You try not to, you try to respond in kind. So somebody shoots a nuke at you, you shoot one back. You don't shoot everything back at them.
Right.
Nobody's ever figured
Hopefully.
out. Well, nobody's ever figured out if that's realistic because all the war games they did in the Cold War, it never stopped with one. So I think when you look at the proliferation of nuclear weapons, two countries that are in hot wars all the time that are nuclear powers we don't really talk about is Pakistan and India. Look at all the efforts to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon.
Yes.
When people say, well, the Cold War's over and that's nothing you worry about anymore, I'm like, the traditional, somewhere we're just going to intentionally launch. No. An accident, yes. A regional conflict that gets too hot
Hmm.
and starts to spill out. What happens
Hmm.
now with Pakistan and India if they went to a nuclear exchange? Where is Russia, China, and the U.S. on that? And don't forget, the Brits have nuclear weapons. The French have nuclear weapons. The Israelis have nuclear weapons they don't acknowledge. We know other countries like South Korea, Japan could develop nuclear weapons relatively quickly if they saw that the U.S., who's been previously their missile shield, says, well, no longer. We know
So
North
how do
Korea
you mitigate for? I mean, is there a preparation? I mean, or is that what we're doing? This is like you're into whole new territory. I don't have any questions here. So you.
The problem is, to me, is the decision-making process, de-escalating a situation, avoiding inflammatory rhetoric. All these things seem to be in the past. And even when I was in Washington, the time frame from we detect a launch until we could get the president to safety was minimal, much less do any of the other programs that we have for the continuity programs, which were, when I walked in there, I knew of them, but, I got into them. And they're pretty much classified. But the idea is, how do you keep enough of the federal government up and running to reestablish the government if DC got hit?
Kind of like what happened after 2011.
Yeah.
I
When
mean,
9/11
9/11. Yeah.
that actually for the first time had triggered a true continuity of government
Right.
response where you had, DC was the target, you were evacuating Congress, you were evacuating key federal agencies. If you remember, Vice President Cheney was at an undisclosed location for many
That's
months
right.
after that. because the concern was, did the terrorists have access to improvised nuclear weapons? And could they smuggle one in? So, I mean, it's again, people are saying with all the floods, hurricanes, and all the other stuff, why are you worried about that? And I'm like, well, in emergency management, we don't get to pick what we want to worry about. The other thing that it's not keeping me awake at night, but I think it's a misnomer when people talk about climate change. I'm like, it's already changed.
I love when my guests segue into a question that I have later on, and you just did that. So I was going to ask you about that. How do you, as an emergency management expert, navigate when there's either climate change denialism or shaming if you acknowledge, like, it just seems sort of, how can you function in that kind of an environment?
Well, part of it is you focus on the impacts. Everybody talks about, well, it's real, it's not real. I thought President Obama framed it best right after Superstorm Sandy made landfall, and we were getting up to go meet with Governor Christie.
Mm-hmm.
He talks to me, and we're walking out to get ready to go, and he says, the debate about climate change is over. We really need to talk about adaptation. And it turned out talking about adaptation was actually more controversial with people that were champions of climate change agendas, because they felt that if you talk about adaptation,
you're throwing your
up.
hands up and you're saying we lose.
But the assumption is you think you can do something maybe in the future, but it's already changed.
Right.
I mean, how many extreme rainfall events? It seems like monthly to weekly occurrence of an extreme rainfall event, record-setting flooding in places that had never happened before.
Cities and counties are now sending out king tide, this coming up. I get them all the time from like Palm Beach and Tampa and Hillsborough or Tampa Bay.
Talk to people that grew up in Miami, they're going, yeah, we've never seen this before.
Right. My family. Yeah. Yeah.
It used to be once a year, maybe twice a year, you got the king tides. It was not a monthly occurrence. And then we get to, wildfires and the wildfire seasons. It used to be, it was fairly defined on the West Coast. Now it's like year round. This depends on the weather. People forget Florida, was trying to burn down in 1998 after a multi-year drought, and we had wildfires all over the place. But as you see more and more of these events that are record setting that we don't have any past data, which goes all the way back to, a little history. The Weather Service actually started under President Grant. It's a bureau of the Signal Corps, that the lessons he learned in the Civil War about how critical weather was, and the system they'd set up to bring in weather data from all the Army outposts over telegraph, assemble it in Washington, and issue reports and forecasts back to the combatant commanders, he found extremely useful. So he established within the Army and the Signal Corps the first Weather Bureau, which ultimately became the National Weather Service. So we have data, at least going back to that date, to any Army post in the country. And when you're setting records, people say, well, it's happened before. Well, not since then, if it's a record-setting event.
Do you feel that the state is doing enough to acknowledge and prepare for to adapt to climate change?
It's interesting. It's like code. You can't say climate change.
I know. That's why you heard me stumbling for words, right?
But they're doing mitigation.
But they're calling it something else. Like, we're erasing climate change from the statutes, but on the down low, we're making sure like we're prepared. I don't know. Seems.
Yeah, exactly. Or we're doing mitigation to reduce the impacts of flooding. The thing that I found really fascinating was, if you remember during Hurricane Milton, the national media had swarmed to Tampa, and they couldn't find a lot other than the arena, the roof came off. There wasn't a lot of wind damage in some of those areas. So they were showing you the flooding.
Yeah.
Which if you're from Florida, you're looking at flooding going, it ain't in the house. The streets are supposed to flood. That's the drainage system.
Mm-hmm.
And the roofs were attacked. And I'm like going, our building code is really good and good. We're seeing in new construction less and less wind damage. Flooding, however, is extensive. And this is where I go back to Florida legislature. They may not talk about climate change, but they did something that's extremely useful in mitigating climate change. If you remember, after Hurricane Irma, Citizen had all of these people that were policyholders that filed claims that turned out they didn't have flood insurance. And so the
Right.
Florida legislature came back and says, well, we're going to change the law so that if you buy a citizen's policy, even if you're not in the special flood risk area, we're going to require flood insurance because we're seeing flooding over areas that have never flooded before where people don't have flood insurance. And if you think about it, they never said climate change.
Right.
All of a sudden, it's this important. It's because they saw how many people lost everything because they didn't have flood insurance.
That's
And
right.
most of them was outside of the areas where you have to buy flood insurance for a mortgage.
That's right. That's right. They did do that. And still, we're struggling. Citizens is going up, it's going down, going up, going down. I think there's a lot of claims that we're doing better on the insurance side of it. We'll talk about that another time. Right now, emergency management in Florida and nationally, DHS, is part of this whole immigration crackdown. Is that something that you would have envisioned that emergency management would be taking ownership of?
Yeah, it happened in 2005. In 2005, FEMA was being taken apart by DHS. They were losing people and resources to go fight the war on terrorism. They were taking money out of FEMA's program. They were actually supposed to do an exercise in Louisiana in the spring of 2005 for the state, a major exercise, and DHS took the funding. Morale was low. A lot of people that had responded in '04 were gone. And so you get, right now they're fixated on immigration at the expense of everything else. I referred to that era as the era of homeland hysteria. I said, yeah, we got to get ready for terrorism. There's things we got to do, but hurricanes aren't going to go away just because you're focused on something else. So even when I was in the Obama administration, we ended up supporting Customs and Border Protection when they got flooded at the border with the unaccompanied children.
Mm,
We're asked by the
I forgot
administration.
about that.
So we treated that as mass care. I figured it was kids. And my position was I'm not debating the immigration policy. They're already here. We're being asked to take care of them. There's a process to determine, do they stay, do they leave, do they go to foster care? But in the intermediate, they need to be taken care of. And so that's what we got tasked with. I think the real challenge for emergency management is, and it's not just immigration, but it's this tendency for politicians to see emergency management as a solution to every problem that they can't figure out. Everything from homelessness to, now immigration. And I try to tell people, I said, we're really good at the acute situation. We're not good at the chronic problems. If you need something done quickly, it's a core competency. But you also got to remember, the more you distract or take away from the core functions of being ready for the next disaster, the question is, will you be ready?
On my list of questions, politics and emergency management, core functions. So you are like 10 steps ahead of me. No question about that. I mean, that's what I fully expected.
But again, I tell people, in my line of work, you got to be pretty much apolitical, but you also need to understand politics.
Right.
And you need to understand, sometimes the situation is you're going to grit your teeth and do something that you say probably shouldn't be doing this, but it's not illegal. And will not doing this cause us more problems? To a certain degree, emergency management became a victim of their own success at the state levels because they were the ones people went to when other things failed. We saw this a lot during COVID, where it was additionally in public health, but then a lot of these things that were not dealing with public health, but were impacts of COVID, like unemployment. The whole thing about how you feed people when stores are closed.
Sure.
And so those were, again, people look to the emergency management programs. FEMA became a huge player in the Trump administration.
PPEs.
Yeah. So, again, I try to be apolitical, but you got to understand the politics. And sometimes when dealing with the politics, you got to really try to help them frame what we're good at, what we're not good at. And oh, by the way, you don't want to take away from your ability to handle the next disaster because you've redirected or focused or took resources away, which is essentially what happened in 2005 to FEMA before Katrina hit.
Well, I wanted to ask you about, but I know you're busy. I have all the time in the world, so you just tell me when we're getting near the end of our time with you. But there's a couple things, and plus we have some fun questions, and we don't want to miss out on those. But I wanted to ask about cuts to FEMA and cuts to public broadcasting. Those are two different issues that affect emergency management, and you've been vocal about the cuts to public broadcasting and the cuts to FEMA. I was wondering, I think there also was talk about dismantling FEMA at the federal level and sending it down to the states. Tell us your thoughts on those two issues, please.
Well, the first one was the administration when the president was, campaigning uh, in the response to Hurricane Helene in the Carolinas. Started that first statement of, FEMA's too broke. We ought to just abolish it.
Right, right.
Uh, then he brought in the Secretary of DHS from South Dakota. She continued that. And so initially, the first couple of months of administration, it seemed very much we're going to abolish FEMA and just give everything back to the states. And you had a couple of states said, yeah, we'll do that. And then other people thought about it and says, no. And so if you've listened, and it's, the president set by executive order a FEMA review council. And Kevin Guthrie from the state of Florida is on that council. Nem Kidd from the state of Texas is on that council. There's a couple other people I know that are on that council. They have strong, deep emergency management backgrounds. And you're hearing from the states and local governments, we want to reform FEMA. We don't want to abolish it. And generally, when most people are talking about abolishing FEMA, they're talking about the recovery programs that we administer, FEMA administers under the Stafford Act, and the complexity of that. And again, even when I was in the Obama administration, I was proponent of we need to simplify and move money faster. And we had gotten some tools after Sandy we were showing some success, but then it kind of went away. Now we're back to the point where can we provide aid faster while maintaining, because there's other thing, it ain't FEMA's money, it's your tax dollars. Can we maintain it won't ever be what I call red tape free because there's always rules, but can we minimize the friction between a disaster to states and the people impacted and the assistance they get? So I've been very supportive of that. But the other part of that is the cuts to FEMA, and everybody says, well, you're going to cut FEMA. I says, folks, I went through sequestration where our budgets were just frozen. They were cut every year. We couldn't hire staff. We couldn't grow. We had to do with what we had. And no different than in Florida. If you remember when I was there with Governor Chris, we hit the recession in the state of Florida, cut budgets like crazy. And it's like, so I had learned a long time ago is, you've got to work with the budget you've got. And it doesn't do any good to whine about it, because trust me, if they could have given you more money, at least in Florida, they would have, but they couldn't. They had to cut.
So suck it up, Buttercup.
Well, no, it was more of.
No, I'm saying just,
my approach was with it. FEMA,
man up.
We got three buckets: the things we've got to do, the things we should do, and the things we want to do.
Yeah.
First thing we're going to cut are the things we want to do. So I cut travel, I cut conferences. A lot of people weren't happy about that. And I said, guys, I'm more concerned about preserving positions that I have and making sure we can execute our primary mission, which is coordinating on behalf of the president in response to governors and disasters. It took that so when people say, well, you're cutting all these people, I'm like, if you're just cutting them randomly without a plan, yeah, that's a problem. But just saying you can't cut staff.
It doesn't really mean anything unless you know the whole picture.
Yeah. So
okay.
Standpoint, I'm like, okay, fine. Right. I'm more concerned that they don't have a FEMA administrator. And I kind of get where the president's going, well, I want to see what the FEMA Review Council is going to do, because if I'm going to make substantial changes, I don't want to have somebody in there as the director.
Oh, right.
So
she came under a lot of heat, right? The FEMA administrator. I can't remember.
He and Criswell, but it was essentially the attacks on the response to Helene.
Right. But some of that was political, right?
Yeah. And again, it's FEMA's convenient, I think, because people forget FEMA's success is really based upon local government in the state. And FEMA's not really designed to come in there and replace that. It's designed to come in there and support it. And they can bring a lot of support. So it's not like we're just like waiting for the state to fail. But there's a tendency that FEMA becomes, and we saw this in Katrina, that FEMA became the brunt of all the attention.
Oh, yeah.
And people, after Katrina.
Heck of a job, Brownie.
Well, there's actually a proposal after Katrina to abolish FEMA and start over again.
Okay, there. So it's not, everything old is new again, right? Oh
Well,
no,
really,
everything.
I just see so many parallels between 2005,
That's
before
interesting.
Katrina made landfall, and where
Yeah.
we at in 2025.
Wow. Wow. And we're having that 20th anniversary. And so let's talk about the cuts to public broadcasting because I've said it before. I had Sergio Bustos, the vice president. I'm butchering his title, but he's in the head of the news for WLRN down in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties on the podcast not long ago. And I know that here in Tallahassee, we really rely on WFSU during storms when we have no power and no, I'm using my little solar powered radio to listen to them because they're 24/7. So tell us why eliminating funding for public radio is not a good idea.
Well, it's just that they are in many parts of the country the main source of information during disasters, both the warning systems, the emergency broadcast system, or the emergency alert system that runs over them. But more importantly, as we've seen time and time again, they're often one of the few things up and running, especially in rural parts of the state. And this is true across the country. So, again, this is one of these things, and I've been a proponent of public radio. When I was here and when I was the emergency manager of Alachua County, I worked with UFT, AMF, or FM, and I worked with all the public media properties at the University of Florida, WUFT, Channel 5. I mean, I grew up, Channel 5 was the only television station you could get in Gainesville, unless you had a really good antenna pointed at Jacksonville, and then you get
I
WJXT.
didn't know that.
We had no commercial stations in Alachua County.
Oh, well, that's true. You were really
When
remote
I
back
grew
then.
up, and this is true still in a lot of areas, these rural markets, people think, well, satellites and cable have overtaken that. Uh, Problem is when disasters hit,
That's
that
right.
usually goes,
That's exactly right.
and it's the broadcaster. So part of this is it's all radio stations, commercial and the public radio stations. But it's also that after disasters, public radio doesn't have the demand signal to get back to commercial programming for revenue. So they can go longer and more in depth and provide that 24-hour wall-to-wall coverage that a lot of times think of how many commercial radio stations are actually syndicated. They don't really have a lot of staff. I mean, there are some stations that they have a GM, a sales force, and an engineer, but
Mm-hmm.
no air personnel because it's all syndicated. So that local media, day in and day out, just covering local stories, but during disasters, it becomes one of those lifelines of information.
Lifeline of information. That's a good way of putting it. We're in I think September is preparation month. Am I right?
Yeah, it's National Preparedness Month. It came out of the some of the legacy things from September 11th. So
Okay.
it's not hurricane preparedness.
Oh, right. No, we had that several months ago. I had Mark
But
Wool from NOAA on the show and the start of hurricane season, but preparedness month gave me a little bit of a segue to ask you we're still in hurricane season in Florida. We've had some of our worst storms in October, right? September. So what is in your hurricane kit?
a bunch of ham radio equipment,
Ham radio equipment.
lots of big batteries. I've been one of the things I have is I have a solar system as a backup with the ability that when the power goes out, parts of the house switches over. I've augmented that. I've added some new capabilities. I was doing some work for one of the companies that sells the battery and solar panel systems, and so they gave me one as a here, try it out. I liked it so much I added more. So uh, I'm getting to the point where I won't have to use a gas generator for at least 3 or 4 days.
Wow.
The thing that I'm finding that when we took our biggest hit was actually Helene this past year. And it was always interesting to me was here I was, emergency manager state, emergency manager at FEMA. I never get hit by disasters because I was always responding to them. But when I got out, I got hit by Irma, lost power. I lived in Gainesville downtown. I lost power for about 4 days.
Mm-hmm.
When Helene hit, I lost trees, power. We were down to pretty much radio and my ham radio stuff. And I was running at that point everything on battery, and it was like really nice not having to listen to a generator, worry about fuel. And so I still got the gas generator, still a backup. But to me, the biggest thing is the fact that pretty much I keep refrigerator going, freezer going, coffee
Right.
maker, very important. My
Coffee
hammer,
maker is very important.
if I'm between interviews and stuff, I'm a lot of times on the ham nets, hearing what's going on, and have the ability, because there's some cool stuff you can do with ham radios today. So I get send emails all over the country. So even when the internet's down, I can still get stuff out. And then it's the usual stuff. I don't really spend a lot of time stocking up on a whole bunch of stuff that other people think they got to have all the stuff. It's more like a scavenger hunt. We got first aid kits, we got fire extinguishers.
Well, I mean, if you have battery, whatever, generator, solar power sources, you're really not as vulnerable as those of us like me who do not have a generator. And I take insulin. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and so I'm always, when I have all these, stockpiles of insulin in the refrigerator, and I'm always rushing it over to my friend's house, my neighbor who has a generator, and I have my little, bug out bag for the insulin, and so that's what I do. And my other neighbors, I don't have a generator, so yeah, it would be nice if I didn't have to listen to the noise of the generator, but unfortunately my across the
This is
street neighbor
it's kind
does.
of it's kind of interesting. The technology's changed so fast, and we really never told people to do this. And gas generators are limited to, I got to be outside. They don't work for apartments. They don't really work for condos. I'm having to run extension cords everywhere. I can't use it inside because we saw what happened with carbon
Oh
monoxide poisoning.
yeah, so
With
bad.
the self-contained lithium-ion batteries, which are what they call them LiPo4, so they have very low fire risk, with the built-in inverters that can generate power with a push of a button. And once they're charged up, they'll hold power for like a year. And if you add solar panels to it, you can recharge them. And that's why they call them solar generators. But they come in various sizes. And the price break on them is actually getting to where they're in a range that I think it's a more affordable option.
Like
And
what
it,
range?
some small ones, a couple $100, to the big ones that will run your house, $5,000 to depending on how many batteries. But
So
the ones that work for most people, like if you needed to run your medicine, keep your refrigerator going,
yeah.
$1,000 or less.
Okay,
And,
well, I learned something because I didn't know that was even an
and, and
option.
and the best thing about this is you can run them inside. They don't produce any carbon monoxide. They don't make any noise. They hum. And once they're charged up, they go. And these were originally primary markets for campers and outdoor people.
Hmm.
But when I got involved, and I'm like, this is like huge. And for my whole house solar system, that's built in. Like I got the solar panels, I got the batteries, I got inverters. It's wired into the house. But if I leave the house, it can't go with me. The new smaller units that are portable, I don't have to wire in. I can just plug stuff into them. They've got now bigger ones you can run into your electrical panel and do the automatic switching. But to me, the really interesting range is these that are between a couple $100 to maybe $2,000 that will provide power for your essential functions, your medicine, keep your electronics charged,
And
run enough.
something like an old gal like me can figure out how to use on her own and
Press a
doesn't
button.
need your neighbor to come and manage and
It's like it has an on-off switch. It has
right.
outlets like you would plug into your wall.
Okay, I think you just might have sold something.
But
Our
it's
power goes
interesting.
out a lot in Tallahassee, in case anybody
Yeah.
listening
Well,
elsewhere doesn't know that.
with all our lightning storms and stuff, or the idiots that run into the power poles,
Yeah.
it's not uncommon. And I really believe that in the 50s and 60s, when the power went out, it was an inconvenience. If you go to today, when the power goes out, people are in danger. I mean,
It-
just think of, you're one example. Just think of how many people are dependent upon medical devices,
yeah.
refrigerated medications. Just think how our homes aren't really built like they used to be. So when the power goes out in the middle of summer, it becomes literally get
Yeah.
lethally hot.
Yeah.
And so having options that go the whole range from a couple $100 all the way up to the huge units, but they're portable. To me, like just take Tallahassee, Gainesville, have such huge student populations, but also have large transient populations. Emergency power is really not an option for somebody living in an apartment or a condo or
Mm-mm.
was just renting.
Mm-mm.
These units are. And if you have to evacuate, you can take them with you.
That's really good to know. I didn't mention, and I don't think I've talked to you since then, but I had a tree come through my roof during Hermine, and I ended up having to move. And it was, Indian Head Acres. I don't know if you remember Indian Head Acres here in Tallahassee. They got hit by a bunch of the tornado thing that took down a bunch of trees. Tallahassee has a lot of trees too. That's part of the problem, not just the transient and population, but we have a lot of trees. We love our canopy roads, right? So this is great. I'm glad we're doing this because this is good information for people who live in areas that have been really hit hard by storms not that long ago. And I still have PTSD from this storm several years ago, when it rains hard.
Again, this really started coming on about 5 or 6 years ago. It was really marketed to the outdoor enthusiasts.
Mm-hmm.
But when I got involved, the company was Jackery, and they approached me about this because they were finding people were buying them for storms and in the aftermath and stuff like that. And the more I got into it, the more, and it was funny because they called me and said, "Yeah, I already bought one of your things."
Oh,
I
that's
got
funny.
what I ran all my ham radios on during Helene.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
I went 3 days. I had my radios going, I had my computers going, I had my lights going, all off of this self-contained battery unit. I had some solar panels thrown up on the roof, and it would recharge during the day, and I'd bleed it down at night.
Yeah, I mean, it's really we don't realize just how dependent we are on our devices too, because I can't remember which storm it was. It was a couple years ago here in town, and I didn't have any damage to the house where I live now in Midtown, but the power was out and the cell phone towers were out. So I couldn't communicate with my daughter who lives in another city, and I was able to text, and like once I could get a text through and then I couldn't. And this went on for days. It was really scary. It was really unsettling to
Well,
feel like you're, just cut off. And that was one of the reasons why the public radio was so significant.
when Irma was hitting, we lost power, we lost cable,
Mm-hmm.
we lost cell.
Mm-hmm.
The only information I was getting was from WUFT
Right.
over the FM radio, and Irma was coming up the West Coast, and the conditions in Gainesville, we got flooded, and the wind, and I didn't know where the storm was. I didn't know if it was passing off of Cedar Key or what. And it
Right.
turned out it kind of split off because all of a sudden I'm starting to hear radio reports over WUFT about flooding in downtown Jacksonville, and the St. Johns River's flooding. And I'm like, wait a minute, this storm was supposed to be off the West Coast. What's
Right.
going on? And the storm started expanding and breaking apart, and it was pushing water back into the St. Johns. I was former FEMA. I'd be looking at data links, satellite communications, you name it. Here I
Right.
am in Gainesville with a portable radio,
Wow.
gas generator running outside my window to keep my refrigerator from melting.
Oh my gosh.
First morning I made coffee, I made it on my grill on the burner.
Me too. That's what I do. Yeah.
So, here I went from all the technology, all the
That's
information.
funny.
I'm listening to a radio station. It was WUFT FM in Gainesville, the local public broadcast
Down here with
station.
the masses,
That's where I was getting my information.
Yeah. Let me ask you a couple of quick fun questions, and then we'll let you weigh in with your final thoughts for us. Okay, this is a question we ask all the guests on the show, most of them. I didn't ask the Archbishop of Miami-Dade Archdiocese this question, but I'll ask you. Crocs, yay or nay?
Yeah.
Okay,
We're-
great. What color?
They were blue, but they're kind of gray right now.
Okay, yay for you. Pumpkin spice, yay or nay?
Nay.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you're 2 for 2 right now. Your favorite app on your phone?
Probably Gmail because I use it all the time.
Something people don't know about you that you would be willing to share with us today.
No, I already told you I was a ham radio operator.
Yeah, that is I didn't know that actually. If you could go back, you're going to give us another?
I've been doing so many things for so long. I think pretty much everything I've ever done has been put out there. But yeah, just being a ham radio. I wasn't a ham in the state. I became a ham when I got to FEMA because I decided I wasn't going out to the.
See, I didn't know that
hotel
about
circuit
you.
and
That might
all
be
stuff.
why.
And so I'd get home from FEMA. I had to do something, So I took up ham radio.
Instead of crocheting. Good for you. If you could go back and live at any point in time, where would you go?
Probably the 30s through the pre-World War II period.
Speakeasy days.
No, it was prohibition
Post speakeasy days.
it was this fascinating
The
time.
30s is the Depression, isn't it?
Yeah, we were still going in and out of it. But the late 30s to 1940, when the U.S. was going from an isolationist to having to really think about how do you build an army, and the decisions that were made in the politics. But the fascination to me was the logistics of rearming that began in the late 30s. That by the time we got into the World War II started, was accelerating, and things like just where we were to where we ended up 5 years later, and how that was done. To me, is just a fascinating study of decisions that were being made prior to the attack of Japan that hadn't been made. We would have been in much worse shape.
Well, that's interesting. Thank you again for joining us. Before we say goodbye, what is there that we haven't talked about that you'd like to add, or anything, any thoughts that you have before we say farewell?
If you live in Florida and you live near the coast, know your evacuation zone. And when the orders come, go. Don't wait. Don't delay. It's probably the one thing we can do to reduce loss of life is just get people to evacuate. And I've heard all the excuses. I've lived here all my life. It's never that bad. We'll get stuck on the road, all this other stuff. And all I do is I go back down to Lee County and look at what happened during Ian.
Oh,
to
yeah.
people
So
in the
bad.
back.
Thank you for that reminder. Do you remember the press skits? Do you remember that I played you in one of the press skits?
I'm not sure I saw that one, but I've been to several.
I played you in one of the press skits. It wasn't really you. It was more of a mashup of you and me. And I did it in a video for the speaker's office. I think it was the Speaker Weatherford's office. I'm trying to remember. And I dressed up in a CERT cap and polo. And I'm known for swearing. I didn't do it this whole time. I'm like, we don't have to put an explicit warning on this episode, but I'm known for swearing. And I think at the time I was smoking cigarettes. So I was doing you with the cap, and I was standing at the podium with the cigarette in my lip and swearing, telling people to get a bleepity bleep plan, because that was the get a plan days.
Yeah.
So anyway, get a plan, right? Know your evacuation zone. Be prepared. We are in Florida. It is still hurricane season. Craig Fugate, thank you so much for joining us today. Just tell us, what are you doing now? If people want to follow you, how do they get a hold of you? Where you're back in Gainesville? What are you doing now?
Consulting. I'm on a couple of boards, and I do a lot of senior subject matter expert type advising to startups and other companies and stuff. So
You're on Twitter. You're on X.
Yeah, but really I spend most of my time on LinkedIn these days.
LinkedIn. All right. I'm trying to get my LinkedIn chops up. So, all right. Craig Fugate, I've said goodbye 3 times. This time I mean it. Thank you so much. I can't wait to see you again.
Thanks for listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida, hosted by News Service senior writer Dara Cam and produced by me, Mike Exline. Music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs, LLC.